Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. The clock is ticking for Congress to complete both the impeachment inquiry and some key legislative items. Thursday marks the deadline for Congress to pass a government spending bill. Lawmakers are expected to approve a stopgap measure. It would avoid a shutdown, but only until the middle of next month. On Monday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi assured colleagues Congress was both legislating and investigating without issue. She said a discussion on a new trade bill, another big agenda item right now, was, quote, constructive and will continue this week. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is striking a different tone. Today, the Republican said impeachment is stalling the agenda in both chambers of Congress.
Nothing is happening because House Democrats are seized with Trump derangement syndrome, are consumed with this argument with the president, which seems to me particularly ridiculous since we're going into the presidential election. And the American people will have an opportunity in the very near future to decide who they want the next president to be.
These comments come as Capitol Hill prepares for 9 witnesses to provide public testimony this week. We will hear from 3 people who heard the president's highly scrutinized phone call with Ukraine's leader. In addition to those officials, former special envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker will appear. He's expected tomorrow and was requested by both parties. The next day, we can expect the ambassador to the European Union. Gordon Sondland is considered a key witness. Late last week, Ambassador Bill Taylor told lawmakers Sondland was asked directly by President Trump about whether Ukraine was ready to launch an investigation into his political rivals. The origin of that information is from David Holmes. He is a political counselor at the American Embassy in Ukraine. CBS News has learned Holmes will testify Thursday. Let's bring in Zeke Miller and Natalie Andrews. Zeke is CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Natalie is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to both of you. Natalie, let me begin with you. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, has already had to clarify his testimony once before. So where can we expect lawmakers to focus their questions this time around?
They are wanting to talk to Sondland because he talked to the president and said he talked to Mulvaney. And so expect Democrats and even Republicans to want to not trap him, but get into the nitty-gritty, get into the details on what his conversations were like with the president. This is a person who was appointed to his ambassadorship because of donations that he made to the president. He's a longtime GOP donor, but he's not someone that has this diplomatic history. And so we know that he was kind of working around and wanting these investigations, and he has had to amend his testimony and didn't disclose the call he had with the president the first time. So expect both parties to needle him a little bit to try to get to the details. And we'll have to see which route he takes, if he says that he remembers and gets into detail with the president and perhaps says negative things about the president, or if he takes the path he did in his original deposition and said he doesn't remember.
So, Zeke, do we know how the White House feels going into another round of public testimony this week? There was a lot of criticism over the fact that Democrats were talking to witnesses whom Republicans said had no firsthand knowledge of anything, the president did regarding Ukraine. And now we're going to be speaking with several witnesses who did have firsthand knowledge, either of the phone call or reportedly spoke to the president about certain things. So is the White House taking a different tact this week?
They seem pretty confident about all the testimony, what's going to come out, everything except for Ambassador Sondland. That's sort of the big X factor, because it really is unclear, as Natalie just laid out, what tact he's going to take. Is he going to sort of tie himself again to the president in that testimony, or is he going to try to maybe give Democrats on the committee what they want because he's fearful that maybe he wasn't entirely truthful the first time with lawmakers, or try to carve out some pathway in the middle there. And it really isn't clear. And that's sort of the big concern of the White House is what will come out of that testimony on Wednesday. But they are looking forward to testimony of the likes of Tim Morrison and others who have testified privately before lawmakers. And from the White House's standpoint, they believe that it has only bolstered their case that the president sort of conditioned this aid on investigations, but not necessarily Biden, or that the people who were directly involved with the call many of them did not flag it, and that others who heard it second or third hand maybe didn't get the full accurate readout. That's sort of the White House contention here. That is certainly not what Democrats seem to think happened there as well. But everything but Sondland, the White House is confident on right now.
Right. So, Natalie, following up on some of what Zeke said, a lot of the criticism of these public hearings, or at least some of the criticism, is about how these witnesses have already provided testimony. Simply, they did it before behind closed doors. So do we know if Democrats are planning to ask anything new of those appearing for a second time this week?
Based on last week, we didn't get new revelatory information, but we did get more detail. We got a better perspective on how these relationships work. And that's actually one thing Republicans want to highlight, is they want to be able to show that diplomacy is complicated, and this aid and trying to get investigations and corruption, as Republicans describe it, is complicated. And they're hoping that Mr. Volker will offer that perspective. Volker and Morrison are two people that Republicans requested. So they're really hoping to dig deep and kind of add some gray to what Democrats are hoping is black and white, that the president asked for these investigations, he was withholding aid. They're hoping that that point really comes home.
All right, and Zeke, sticking with the Democrats, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was on Face the Nation this Sunday, and she invited President Trump to testify as part of the impeachment inquiry. President Trump apparently was watching the interview because he tweeted today in response. He says he would consider submitting written answers to lawmakers. But Zeke, how likely is that?
Talking to White House officials today, they say it's not particularly likely. I mean, the president, of course, did submit written answers eventually to special counsel Robert Mueller, and that was after more than a year's worth of lengthy deliberations whether or not he would appear in person, submit to an in-person interview with Robert Mueller's investigators or not. And he also only answered a limited set of questions, only about some matters but not others. And that was after the results of almost a year's worth of negotiations. This sort of offer by the president could be viewed as a little bit of a stall tactic as Democrats are trying to wrap this impeachment inquiry up before the end of the year and get to an articles of impeachment vote potentially by Christmas. This is the president saying, if you want to talk to me, this is going to take a little bit longer. The president, of course, has blocked pretty much everyone in his administration from officially participating, though some have appeared once they're personally subpoenaed, and has also blocked the sort of documents being transferred over to the committees. So that would be a significant break there. That's partly why most people inside the White House seem to think this is more of a negotiating ploy or a public relations ploy rather than any real serious offer on the part of the president.
Yeah, I doubt the committee is holding its breath, waiting for the president to testify. Natalie, you reported today how Democrats are seeing impeachment used against them ahead of 2020. So how is the inquiry hurting these lawmakers, especially when we're talking about these other deadlines like a government shutdown, which, of course, nobody wants to see in an election cycle ahead of next year?
Yes, certainly. We talked to the Democrats who are in districts that Donald Trump won. There's 31. Expect to hear that number a lot in the next year. But these 31 Democrats, all but 2 of them, supported moving into the impeachment inquiry, and already they're seeing television ad buys. I think American Action Network is spending about $7 million on TV just attacking them for the impeachment vote. They're also spending money on vulnerable Republicans, encouraging them to stick with the president. But you see, I talked to Elaine Luria, who released an ad last week where she recited her oath of office, and said, when I talked to her, she said that this oath of office was so important to her that the political consequences do not matter.
And Zeke, your publication, the Associated Press, reported today that the U.S. officials knew Ukraine had anxiety when it came to President Trump. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, we know from a lot of other leaders when in other nations, not just specifically Ukraine, when new administrations take power, they often seek out consultations with the local embassy or State Department officials, other contexts, to sort of figure out how to approach President Trump, who is in many ways different than a lot of his predecessors in the ways we all know. But here specifically, there were conversations because some in Ukraine were seeing what was playing out on television, whether by the president's allies and columns in conservative media and the like, attacking Ambassador Yovanovitch and trying to call on the Ukrainian government to launch all of these investigations. They were aware that this was taking place largely in domestic U.S. media. They were trying to navigate that, and some of that those conversations did filter back to Washington, and that is an indication that while yes, the government of Ukraine might not have been entirely aware that its aid was held up through much of the summer, but they were sort of aware of Washington's request for these sorts of what they had viewed as politically troublesome investigations several months prior.
And they were trying to figure out what to do about it. All right, so Zeke, House Republicans asked Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin to provide firsthand information he may have relating to the withholding of aid to Ukraine. Senator Johnson responded today and described a call he had with the president on August 31st. Johnson writes, and I quote, "It was only after the president reiterated his reasons for not giving me the authority to tell Zelensky the support would be released that I asked him about whether there was some kind of arrangement where Ukraine would take some action and the hold would be lifted. Without hesitation, President Trump immediately denied such an arrangement existed." So, Zeke, does this statement from Senator Johnson bolster the White House's defense?
It does and it doesn't, and it allows Democrats to see a little bit what they want to give Republicans just enough coverage to sort of buy the party line from the president, because it does track in a way with what Ambassador Sondland had said about reporting about in that same time period of going back to the president and saying, is there a quid pro quo here, and saying, no, there's absolutely no quid pro quo. That's sort of a similar type of arrangement. At the same time, it seemed to be an arrangement in everything but them calling it one from other U.S. officials and the like. And it does lend a little bit more to that timeline of, this wasn't just a White House concern. This has also brought in some Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill. And that gets into a little bit of the question also in Senator Johnson's letter. What actually was it that turned the aid spigot back on later in September? It was the release of sort of the word of that there was this intelligence community whistleblower complaint out there, but also pressure from the president's own party. Republican lawmakers were lockstep with senior non-political U.S. government officials and political officials saying this aid needed to be turned on for U.S. national security needs.
Right.
So it gives the president a little bit of cover in one sense, but also gives Democrats some ammunition as well.
But based on the statement, you can see why Republicans want him to testify. All right, so Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held a news conference today. He was reluctant to take any questions about the impeachment inquiry, but he did have this to say about former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, who, of course, testified last week. Let's listen.
It is worth noting that Ambassador Yovanovitch's departure preceded the arrival of Bill Taylor. So there's some ideas out there that somehow this change was designed to enable some nefarious purpose. You should all just look at the simple fact that it was Bill Taylor that replaced Ambassador Yovanovitch, who in each case has been driving towards the appropriate Ukraine policy, which I'm happy to talk about.
So Secretary Pompeo looks very uncomfortable here, being asked about, his State Department employees, being asked about Ambassador Yovanovitch. He clearly is trying to figure out what role he's supposed to be playing here. Do we know the role the White House wants Secretary Pompeo to play? And is that at odds with his position as Secretary of State? Natalie?
This may be a better question for Zeke since he's tied to the White House, but it certainly is creating this awkward place where we've seen State Department officials come in and testify. They're subpoenaed. They feel like they're doing it on behalf of their country. And then you see the Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and the White House, the administration, not necessarily back them up. And it does seem like this push and pull that's not getting better or resolved.
Zeke, what are you hearing?
Yeah, it certainly does put Mike Pompeo in a tough spot here because he is serving the audience of one by, his relationship with the president is what brought him to Foggy Bottom. It is what is keeping him, in his stature in a very turbulent cabinet and a very turbulent administration. At the same time, he's facing, some very serious alarm bells being rung at the State Department. Ambassador Yovanovitch telling lawmakers last week that there was a crisis because the career nonpartisan diplomats are not being supported by the leadership, and that is the leadership of Mike Pompeo, who is essentially at times having to sacrifice the people who work for him to serve the person he works for. And that's the tension he's facing day in and day out. And as this impeachment process plays out, he's only going to feel more and more pressure.
Caught between a rock and a hard place. All right, Zeke Miller and Natalie Andrews, thanks to both of you. We really appreciate it.